My first record was very much an attempt to kind of plant myself in that realm of music. Being very influenced by bands like The Cure and Cocteau Twins, and I've always pulled from a lot of 80s bands and 80s music. I think maybe what sets this one apart a little bit more so from the other ones is that I think there's a real effort to kind of lean into some of the more pop elements and pop sides of some of these bands.
Welcome to This Broken Mixtape, the podcast that rewinds and presses play on the soundtrack to your life. I'm Jeff Wu.
And I'm Justin Lee.
Wild Nothing frontman Jack Tatum started his then solo dream pop project, making lo-fi recordings in his college dorm room at Virginia Tech. The band's fourth record, Indigo, leans more into Tatum's new wave influences. Thematically, the album explores how love and relationships have shifted in the digital age. We sat down with Tatum before their packed Opera House show to talk about how Indigo took its cue from the pop sensibilities of Roxy music and The Cure, writing songs with Mitsuki and Japanese Breakfast, and why he prefers New Order over Joy Division.
This week our special guest is Jack Tatum of Wild Nothing. Thank you for joining us on the show, Jack.
Absolutely. I'm happy to.
So more than like any of your previous albums, this album feels very influenced by sort of 80s new wave, bands like New Order, Roxy music, The Cure even. I'm wondering, was that a conscious decision going into the studio, or did this just kind of happen organically?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, these are all bands that I've been influenced by and kind of pulled certain aspects of music from that era for quite a while. And I mean, my first record was very much an attempt to kind of plant myself in that realm of music, being very influenced by bands like The Cure and Cocteau Twins, and I've always pulled from a lot of 80s bands and 80s music. I think maybe what sets this one apart a little bit more so from the other ones is that I think there's a real effort to kind of lean into some of the more pop elements and pop sides of some of these bands, and also looking at people like Roxy Music or Tears for Fears, for instance, and bands that were very much, I think, interested in creating some more of like an accessible side of their music.
So on the Closest Thing to Living as track off the album, you use Indigo as a metaphor for constantly immersing yourself in technology use, whether it's on your phone or your computer. What kind of things do you typically do to sort of unplug and just kind of get off the grid, so to speak?
Well, I think it's hard. I mean, and I think that's why when I was writing that song, I was very much thinking about myself, and I don't really want to come at the issue from a position of judgment. And so I think that's very much why I kind of like include myself in that sentiment, because I think it's something that I'm very much guilty of in my own life, and something that I recognize even within my own kind of like day-to-day interactions with people, and sort of the distractions of technology and the ways that affects the way that I interact with people in my life. And so it is difficult, and I think everyone kind of has their own relationship with social media, and some people immerse themselves fully in that projection of their life, or sort of, I think it's just complicated. I think it's a complicated time for just people's sense of identity and what that really means, and how that might differ from their day-to-day real life interactions versus the interactions that they're having online with people that they may not know. Mm-hmm. And sort of, I think everyone is kind of forced to reckon with that a little bit. So I think for me, the best thing that I can do is just like try to take breaks from that. Mm-hmm. And I've that's one reason why I've I've rarely kind of swam in that ocean of trying to do more with social media other than just kind of like informing people. Because I'm scared of the idea of just kind of giving my entire self to this thing. And so I think for me, that's kind of like how I've tried to at least escape a little bit of that.
Mm-hmm. You wrote the closing track "Bend" with Mitski. How did that come to be?
It was actually like a pretty formal thing where we both have the same publishing company, and I was living in Los Angeles throughout most of the recording of this record. And so kind of simultaneously while I was writing this record and recording demos, I was also starting to do a fair amount of writing sessions through my publishing company, which is a pretty ordinary thing for a lot of people to do in Los Angeles. To basically, I would just get set up on these different day-long sessions with people, and we would just kind of get in a room and write together. Sometimes it was more pop-oriented, and other times it was pretty free-form, just kind of whatever we wanted to work on. And so this was one of those cases where Mitski and I were both asked if we wanted to kind of have one of these sessions. And yeah, so we spent the day at my studio space that I had in Los Angeles at the time, and there was really no kind of conversation had before about what we were going to do. And so I just pulled up that song. And at the time I had pretty much demoed out the entire thing, but I was just sitting on it for ages because I couldn't really finish it. There's certain songs where that just happens, and I could not finish that one for some reason. I couldn't come up with a vocal melody that I was happy with. And yeah, basically, you know, I just brought it up for her, and she is like an amazing talent, and kind of just very quickly helped me work through the whole song and come up with a vocal melody that we both liked. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was one of those things where it's just, I felt really lucky to be thrown in that situation and just kind of get the opportunity to work with people that I like through this thing. But it's also one of those things where I'm very rarely the type of person to kind of like ask for those sorts of things. You know, like I very rarely would like hit up someone that I admire and be like, hey, do you want to work on this thing? Right. It just feels weird to me, but but this was kind of one of those situations where it just happened, and yeah, it was just a one-off thing.
Another great talent, you recently wrote a song with Japanese Breakfast, Michelle Zahner, who was on the show early last year.
Oh, cool, yeah.
I know that you said you hopefully want to release that song at some point. How did that whole session go? And I mean, did you guys work well together? And is there sort of potential for you guys to work together in a larger capacity?
I don't know. Yeah, it's just one of those things. It was a very similar situation where, exactly like it was working with Mitski, we kind of just got set up on this writing session. And yeah, that one played out very differently because we kind of just decided to start something from scratch. I think she had kind of an idea that she was working on, which was essentially just like this one keyboard line. And so we opened that up, and then I kind of started playing bass on it, and then yeah, it was very smooth. And that's how those things always work. It's like either you hit a brick wall kind of immediately, or it just flows really easily. And basically we just spent the afternoon writing this song, and it was a lot of fun. You know, it's hard to say if anything will ever come of it. It would be great if it did, but you know, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully, like, we're looking forward to hearing if it does.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun.
I've always been interested in the dynamic of Wild Nothing because, you know, you largely write and record these albums on your own, and then with some, you know, session musicians and whatnot. And then for touring sake, you have a full band.
Yeah.
Do you prefer one over the other, or does each one have its own merits?
Yeah, each one has their own merits, absolutely. You know, I enjoy the amount of control that I have over the writing process and the recording process with the way that it is. You know, it's not to say that I don't enjoy bringing other people into the process, and I have been doing that and definitely did that with Indigo. But that being said, it is hard for me to kind of relinquish some of that creative control, and so I do kind of have a tried and true process when it comes to recording of working on these demos by myself and really essentially, you know, like I think anytime that I share the demos with people, or like, you know, if I were to share the demos with you all, for instance, you would instantly recognize it, because it's not, I basically get it exactly to the place that I want it to be, and then it's just a matter of shaping it very slightly just to kind of make it sound a bit more polished. And I think the more people that are involved in that process, the harder it gets and the more sort of watered down it gets.
Sure.
But I love touring as well. It's just totally different. I always explained it as kind of like the external part of what I do, where I take these songs that have never been played by a full group of people, and then suddenly we have to do it and figure out the ways in which it can work in that context. And yeah, it's great, you know, and it's a completely different relationship too, between myself and the fans of it being like a much more visceral, direct thing of just seeing the ways in which it affects people. But it is very different for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Does geography play a part in just like the influence on the record sound and you know, the songwriting? Because I know that you're originally from Virginia, but you've moved around a little bit in the last few years.
I've moved around quite a lot. I grew up in Virginia, went to college in Virginia, and then I guess around 2010, when the first record came out, I moved to Georgia for a year. I moved to New York. I lived in Brooklyn for about 4.5 years, and then I was in Los Angeles, and now I'm actually back in Virginia. I just moved to Richmond, Virginia, and it's nice. It's just I kind of wanted to be I just kind of wanted to be back closer to home, you know. It's just one of those things where I never really thought I would end up back in Virginia necessarily.
Did part of like being away just kind of make you have this newfound appreciation?
Yeah, kind of. I mean that, but just getting older as well. You know, I think I kind of reached a certain point where I really missed it. You know, there's a familiarity there that I just don't get anywhere else. And as much as I loved living in all these other places, I always felt like it wasn't mine. You know, I just felt like I was on some prolonged vacation.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, geography, it I'm sure it plays kind of a more subconscious role in the way that I work and in the way that my records sound. I mean, I've been pretty lucky to record in a lot of different places, and I think that must have some effect on it. But I think it's one of those things where it's less obvious. You know, there's references on Indigo to Los Angeles, and you know, I think some of the scenes that are set on that record lyrically, when I think of those songs, I'm imagining certain places in Los Angeles, or I'm imagining my house in Los Angeles that I lived in with my wife and things like that. But it's, you know, it's kind of rare that I would like very specifically kind of place my songs, you know.
One of the things we like to talk about on the show is just, you know, our guests, their own sort of journey with music, just as a fan, as a listener. So if you could sort of rewind and go back to your early childhood when you were first exposed to music,
sure.
What kind of stuff was being played around the house?
Yeah, I mean, so my dad plays guitar. My dad is the one that got me interested in playing music, and so he taught me to play guitar when I was about 10 or 11, I would say. Yeah, so we always had guitars around the house. We had a piano growing up that no one could really play, but it was just there. But even just having that, even just having access to that, I think piqued my curiosity at least. And my parents were the kind of people that would listen to music like on a daily basis, and so they had like a pretty extensive record collection that was dwindling as I was a kid, because they, you know, I think they were just kind of getting rid of their records. And like switching over to CDs. But yeah, I remember listening to all kinds of stuff. I remember listening to, you know, they would listen to REM a lot. They were kind of, you know, they were into some cool stuff. And there was also the stuff that they grew up with. And so of course, you know, people like the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, just like classic rock stuff. But also there's plenty of bands that they were listening to at the time, like the Byrds, that I still really love. And but I think for myself, you know, it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I really kind of started finding a musical identity of my own, and kind of trying to be more up to date with, you know, kind of what was happening, contemporary kind of underground music or like independent music. I got very interested in in high school. And
do you remember the first album that you bought?
Yeah, I mean, the first album that I ever bought was Green Day Dookie, and I was like,
that's a popular one on the show. I've heard that.
It's funny. It's so many people my age that I've heard that multiple times. I was probably about like 7 or something, but yeah, I mean, the funny part about that though is that I think I simultaneously bought like an Elton John record too. So I've always had pretty eclectic taste. I never have really kind of, even though it may seem like it from my own music, you know, it might seem like I'm a pretty monotone person music taste wise, but you know, it's just, at least with this project and with the music that I've made as Wild Nothing, it's like I've always felt like I've played into this identity and I've played into these genres that have kind of made Wild Nothing what it is. But that being said, I mean, when I'm at home, I listen to all kinds of stuff. So,
what kind of stuff are you listening to right now?
I mean, I'm into a lot of like 80s Japanese like funk and boogie stuff, and I listen to a lot of soul music at home, 60s stuff as well, like the Byrds and Hollies and the Seeds. Yeah, I don't know, all kinds of stuff. Yeah, a lot of like ambient and sort of modern classical music as well. Just depends on the mood that I'm in, you know.
Yeah. Another thing we like talking about on the show are mixtapes and mix CDs, playlists.
Yeah.
Do you have like a sort of a memorable story involving one of those that you either made for someone or they made for you?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, God, I've made so many mixtapes throughout my life. Most of them just like for girls that I liked.
Absolutely.
Just being a total dweeb in high school.
Did any of them work? Like,
sure. Yeah. Well, it worked in the sense that I think that they enjoyed listening to them. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any like particular story that's good, but I've made too many to even like pick them out at this point. But I will say that I've recently bought a car. Well, not recently at this point. It was like 3 years ago now. But when I moved to Los Angeles, I had to buy a car, and I hadn't had a car in a very long time. And so I bought this kind of like mid 2000s Volvo. It's fine. It's like a whatever car, but it's like just old enough to not have an aux input. Which I kind of didn't even really realize when I bought it because I'm not a thorough person, clearly, but it's been a huge bummer. But I basically just have the CD player. And so when I was at my parents' house, kind of around the same time, I was just like visiting my parents, and I was like going through my old stuff, and I found this giant booklet of my old CDs from like high school and in like early years of college. And so I was like, oh, I'll just take this. But it's pretty funny because there's some mixes in there from like when I was in high school. And I have them in my car currently. And so it's kind of like half music that I am totally fine with people knowing that I listen to it. And then the other half is just like horrendous mixes.
We're more interested in the horrendous half.
Yeah, I'm sure.
What kind of stuff was on there?
I mean, I don't know. It's not so bad really, but like, yeah, there's definitely some forays into like pop punk and stuff from when I was in like 8th grade, and yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get specific because I'll just.
I mean, that's the thing with those kind of bands, even as like sort of embarrassing as they are, when you hear those songs, they still resonate with you. It's kind of great thing about music.
You can recognize when something like isn't for you anymore, but you know, you're at least like, well, when I was 12, this was awesome. So I can't deny myself that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I read somewhere that you want to get into, possibly get into production and writing for other artists. Do you like sort of have some artists in mind that you would love to work with?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think with that, it's just one of those things where I think I would kind of just have to fall into it, you know? I feel that way for a number of reasons, just because I think there's a part of me that's still kind of scared to commit to any sort of recording or production project in that sense, because there's always this part of me where I'm just like, oh, do I really know enough about this to do that for somebody else? Because it's one thing when you're doing it for yourself, because you can do, you have all of your own janky workarounds when it comes to the recording process that are fine when you're just sitting in a room by yourself, but then you kind of worry that someone else might see you doing something and be like, what are you doing?
Right.
But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of things. I mean, and also just whether it's production or songwriting, I mean, yeah, it's something like working with Michelle from Japanese Breakfast, for instance. That was like so much fun, and I would love to do more of that. I don't know. That being said, though, I'm not particularly good about keeping up with like what new bands are doing or like what kind of stuff is happening. So I feel like it would be cool to just have some like young band that like grew up on Wild Nothing or something and kind of like reach out
But I feel like that happens quite a lot. Like you have, certain bands that grew up listening on, there's certain favorites in their collection. And, once they get to that level where they can ask anyone who they want to produce their record, they might go to that same person, right? Like I'm thinking of like Nirvana in particular with when Cobain, who was he asking? Like the guy that did the Pixies record?
What
is
is
it,
his
Steve
name?
Albini or
Steve Albini.
Yeah, Albini.
Or I'm not actually like a huge Nirvana fan, so.
But that sort of thing. And I could definitely see like, it's been now almost 10 years since Gemini came out, so I feel like there are kids that grew up on that record.
Which is crazy because, like I just turned 30, so I don't feel like I'm that old, but once I start kind of thinking about the fact that the 10-year anniversary of my first record is around the corner, I'm like, oh my God, I'm fucking old. But
I mean, you started off really young, so
I get, I did.
Yeah.
Which is funny because at the time I didn't really even think twice about it, but in retrospect, I was extremely young. But I think that's also why, it's hard for me to listen to that record. It's really hard for me to put on Gemini and like enjoy it objectively, because I think there's just so much of that 20-year-old version of me that lives in that record that other people, might not be privy to necessarily, but I see it all just like totally naked and it freaks me out. I'm just like, oh my God, that's you. Like that was who you were. So it is strange.
Do you still play some songs from that album though?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like even tonight we're going to play some. Yeah, it's fun. It's like I don't have the same relationship to them that I did when I was that age.
Yeah.
That has changed, and that always changes. Every record that I put out, you kind of have a new relationship with the older records, but I still get so much enjoyment of like being able to see that making someone else happy. Like songs from that record that might have like meant something to someone else for a completely different reason. That's really like special to me still, even after doing it for so many years.
Yeah. So you still play them in, the original arrangements, and more or less it sounds like what it did on record?
Pretty much. I mean, it was especially hard with that first record just because that record was so homegrown in a way that the others weren't. And so, I mean, like, it's kind of hard to replicate that record sometimes, certain songs, because there's a lot of layering on that record that I was not even considering the possibility of how it would be played, and all the drums are programmed drums. So I've had like multiple drummers that I play with like listen to some of those songs and be like, this is not like something that a human can play naturally. Not that they're like difficult parts, but it's just I didn't even really know much about kind of how drums work, and so it's just stuff like that. But it's the same with that record as it is with all the other records. I mean, I think live we've kind of taken the approach of trying to be as true to the records as we can, and I think it works. I think for this project it works, and I think it's kind of what people have come to expect, hopefully, of the show, that it'll kind of like transport them to whatever their feelings or memories are of listening to these records.
I actually wanted to pass along a story. I was talking to my friend Suri today, and she was telling me that her and her husband went to one of your early shows in New York. This was when Gemini just came out. So this would have been 2010, I believe.
Yeah.
And you guys were opening for Superchunk.
Oh,
I don't know if you remember that show.
I do.
But her and Dan, they were just really excited, like really loved that record. And they were dancing like crazy, like madmen. And everybody there was just, playing it too cool for school. I guess they didn't know, the opener. So
yeah.
And they were just like getting so annoyed because they were like having so much fun. And it was like idea of
that was like New York for us for so long of just like being a new band playing in New York is always, it's like a test, it's you have all these people that are like coming out just to be like who are these? Who is this band? Are they any good? It can be kind of brutal when you're starting out playing in New York and everything just feels like a trial, So that was probably very much the case for that show as well.
Yeah.
It still is the case in some ways. Like, I mean, I lived in New York for almost 5 years, and there's so much that I love about New York and still hold really dear about New York, but it can be a hard place to play. Yeah, like people's like opinions about things shift very quickly, and so everyone just wants to be like up on the new shit. Yeah. So if you're not the new shit, then like tough luck.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of like the advantage of living in a place like Virginia or any city that's not like just inundated with music. I mean, it's kind of good to just not have too much. I mean, not to say that they're your direct competition or anything like that, but
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about living back in Virginia now is that I'll probably go to shows twice as much as I ever did in New York or Los Angeles, because if there's a show that people are going to every night, you just stop caring, kind of. I mean, I'm sure that's true in Toronto to some degree as well, but yeah.
So we're almost done here, but before we leave, you recently said something in an interview that I have to ask you about, and I'm not judging, I'm not saying one or the other, but you said that, and you very self-aware, you said that, you understand it's not the popular belief, but that you felt that New Order is a better band than Joy Division.
I did say that recently.
So that's cool, but I want to know why you think that.
I think that's very much just a personal preference. I mean, I think that's also kind of an unfair assessment too, because New Order obviously had more output for obvious reasons. I don't know. Joy Division is one of those bands that it's like I know that I'm supposed to love them, but I just don't for some reason.
I think a lot of people pretend to like Joy Division just because you're supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And I like them, but I don't love them.
Yeah. That's just me. I'd rather listen to Bizarre Love Triangle than Love Will Tear Us Apart.
I completely understand
Which
that.
is kind of like, by admitting that, like, I'm showing my true colors and my true dorkiness, I think, but I don't care. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Jack.
Absolutely.
And we're looking forward to the show tonight.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Season 2, Episode 27 of This Broken Mixtape with Wild Nothing frontman Jack Tatum. If you enjoyed this episode, please take the time to subscribe, rate, and share our podcast wherever you're tuning into us today. Also, if you have any comments, feedback, or ideas for guests, feel free to drop us a line through our website, Instagram, or Twitter. You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, and Spotify. As always, thank you for listening. We really appreciate it. Cheers.